Hey everybody, it's Bonkalina here, and in this video we're going to take a backstage look at what a room mesh looks like when it's in 3ds Max, and we'll point out all the different elements involved and pretty much talk about the process involved, not necessarily a step-by-step instruction on how to build a room, but to give you a sense of what's involved in creating room meshes in this particular case, or any mesh in general, and how what goes into making the mesh affects what comes out of it in terms of how you see it. This should give you a sense of whether or not you really want to dive into making meshes, or you just want to continue doing textures on meshes or creating textured meshes, or you just want to remain a consumer and appreciate the meshes that are available to you. Alright, so we're looking at this room. This is my Moroccan club, which is the latest thing I've done as of right now in terms of a room. And as you can see, there's lots of stuff involved here. Some of this is actually furniture and not part of the room, but there are basic elements of the room as well. So this gives you an idea of what the room looks like as done. And now let's take a look at what the room looked like just shortly before it was done. Okay, so here we are in 3ds Max, and this is the very same room. It looks obviously very different than what we see in the client. Some of that has to do with the textures, some of it has to do with the lighting. But in any event, it's always going to look different. It's never, we never really get a true picture of the finished look until we get it into the client. So to start out with, we have first the modeling aspect of this, which is creating the mesh itself, the room, the shape, the elements that go into the room. Do we want to have windows? Do we want to have plants, pillars, and fountains, and what have you, curtains? Those are things that you make design decisions along the way as you're creating the room, and it helps to have a pretty good idea of where you want to start and what you want it to look like, even if it's only a sketch of an idea, or perhaps something that was inspired by a room you saw. Personally, I'll often troll Google for inspiration. I might Google a Moroccan room and try to see what elements of that room I really like and incorporate it into my model. So the modeling part of it is, for the most part, the most fun you'll ever have. It's a lot of fun to do the modeling. Then there are the not so fun parts, and that's the place where you may find yourself getting discouraged, because you find yourself getting bogged down with details, and there are lots of them as you go along and your meshes become more complex. In this case, I modeled a semicircular couch to go into these little nooks that have pillows on them, and I'm going to have the avatar sitting on them, and I've got candles on the table, so there's a lot going on here. Now, the modeling part of it is a blast, but then you've got to start thinking about textures and how those textures are going to lay on that, and how many textures are you going to need so that you can have things be appropriately assigned to different textures. For instance, you wouldn't want to have the same texture applied to the couch as you have to the plant. So it's sort of thinking ahead and figuring out, how do these different textures need to be unique. And then you're going to deal with what would appear to be very trivial things, like what color should that cord be, which texture should I use for the lamp cord, which texture should I use for trim. These are all things that you kind of, once the modeling is done, you have to think about the details. How do I want this to be mapped in a way that makes sense? Because what I create is not the end of it. There are going to be other people who are going to take this mesh and do God knows what with it, and I want to make sure that whatever it is they decide to do, that it doesn't cause problems for them, where it doesn't look right, or that particular texture shouldn't be there, or I want to hide that. But when I do that, it hides this other thing that I want to keep. So how do I strike a balance with all of that? So as you're going along, deciding what texture and what material is going to go where, you have to make some decisions about how you think a person who's going to drive this might want to texture it. And believe me, they are really, I mean, they come up with things I never thought of. And so you want to try to make sure that the mesh is as ready as it can be for the various interpretations that people are going to have of how they would like this mesh to look when it's fully textured. So you're making some decisions for them in terms of how many different materials they're going to be able to use in this mesh, but you want to make sure also that they make sense and that certain things tie together. So when assigning materials to various surfaces on the mesh, you want to think about, well, where else can I use this where it will make sense, and that kind of thing. And also, if I'm using the same texture in these two places, will it make sense if they want to hide it? If I use the same texture, for instance, on this post that I use on the windows, will hiding this post or making this post transparent also make the window frames transparent? Those are things you have to think about as you're going through this. So the modeling part is actually, to be honest, the easier part. The challenge starts coming in when you're assigning what textures are going to go where, how those textures are going to lay on that surface, and how they're going to look. Are they going to be stretched? Are they going to be distorted? And those are things that you want to see in your 3D application before you take it into the client and frustrate your customers. So there's that step, and then, like I said, determining the orientation and how that texture lays on the surface. When you're mapping, when you're doing what's called UV mapping, which is a little bit different from assigning the material to the surface, and everything has to have a material assigned to it, every surface, no matter how small. You do then need to make the decision of how that particular texture is going to be oriented on that surface. Is it going to be a single iteration of that texture, or are you going to do a couple of different iterations of that texture? That's going to be determined mostly by the size of the surface and how much of it you want to cover. The more surface you want to cover, then you need to bump up how many iterations of that texture you're going to have on that surface. So, for example, on this wall, I just need one iteration of that surface, but on this wall I need two in order for the texture to be scaled properly for the size of the wall, and it doesn't stretch. So those are things that you want to think about as your step 2 in creating the mesh. The first one being modeling, the second being mapping, and assigning textures and also aligning textures, figuring out how they're going to sit on that surface. After that, and you've got it all mapped, which is can be a fairly lengthy process for a more complex mesh like this one. Then from there, you work on your nodes, and nodes are how we tell IMVU where furniture and wall hangings and avatars can be placed within this room. The bright green cubes, wireframe cubes that you see on the floor are nodes, and they are, in this case, furniture nodes. You can have as many or as few of them as you want. In fact, if you have none, IMVU is going to call it a locked room because there are no furniture nodes. You cannot place furniture in the room. So every room should have furniture nodes because regardless of how furnished the room is, people always like to add their own stuff, whether it's poses or additional furniture or wall hangings or whatever. So make sure that you have nodes, floor nodes in the room. I also like to include wall nodes in the room because despite the fact that a lot of wall items that are sold are anchored to the existence of a floor node, a wall item, if the wall hanging was made to be a wall hanging, it'll go up a lot easier if there are some wall nodes. So I put wall nodes in as well. It's a somewhat tedious process on the wall nodes because of the changes in the angle of the walls. So you have to continue to work your way around the perimeter of the mesh and making sure those wall nodes are oriented in the right direction so they're pointing out and not, out in space. Okay. So then we have the issue, so then we have our nodes, and so we have our mesh, we have our nodes, and that's great. Now, if I want this to be a reflective room, and I'm going to hide this and pretend it doesn't exist, and pretend that doesn't exist, and here we are with this problem again. Hide selection. Okay, so we're starting out here. It's all good. I can export it like this if I want to, but a lot of people like their reflective rooms, so we give them that. So what I'm going to do is simulate the process of duplicating the room and doing a reflection. So we have this mirror option, and I'm going to mirror it on the z-axis, so it's up and down, and I'm going to make a copy of it. And when I click OK, there's my reflection, basically. Now from there, I'm just going to undo that because I already have a reflection on this. From there, I'm going to also make my black box. Now usually I do this before I've merged everything in the mesh into one thing that I can move around. Normally before this happens, all of these things are separate, and it's a bit of a problem for just doing the inside reflection because if they're not attached, everything has to be selected and it can get very messy. So I usually just attach everything before I do it. But before I attach everything, I take the room's outer shell, which is the outer shape that doesn't have all these windows and curtains and things, and just copy that in the same manner, reflect it, or flip it so that it's a mirror image of the outer shell of the room. And that creates the black box, which I go in and delete things. I mean, I won't get into the nitty-gritty because it's a little involved, but just in general, not specifically, I would create this box that is the shape of the room but doesn't have all its contents, so that it's empty inside, and the reflection can sit inside that. And what that does for me is it helps me to hide that reflection from the outside so that it doesn't look weird and you're not seeing both of them at the same time. That all being done, I can then export all the nodes and the standing nodes, and that is what creates the skeleton. And if you're a creator, under the config options, there is a skeleton option, which is identified as an XSF file. The XSF file basically has information about all these little green boxes and where they are. Then we'll export the mesh, which is the XMF file. And from there, it'll take all the assignments that I've made as far as where the textures are supposed to be and how they're supposed to appear, and write that out to a file including all the other information about the mesh itself, so that essentially you have two components, two minimum components, which is the skeleton and the mesh. And then from there, you can add your textures, submit it to the catalog as derivable, and off you go. That's pretty much what's involved in a very general sense. There are a lot of details that shoot off of those ideas, but that's really the bare bones of it. That's where you begin. Hopefully this makes sense. If you have any questions, just feel free to leave them on YouTube or Facebook, or send a message or whatever. I'd be happy to answer your questions. I can't get into giving you specific lessons about meshing. It's just too involved. But certainly as you go along learning, if you have a specific question, I'd be happy to answer. Okay? Thanks a lot. Have a great day.